So in this discussion, I'm going to look at the beep test or aerobic fitness and how that's used and measured within law enforcement and military or tactical populations. So the beep test is a very common test that's used in tactical assessment for recruitment or for a number of things. It's probably not the best test going that you could do, but it is an easy one to implement in large numbers. It's fairly standardized, so you can get a very sort of comparable result within the test itself. However, there's some sort of physiological considerations with that I'll talk about around individual results and the importance of that. But it's easily to do. You can do it anywhere. The results are repeatable. It's kind of has some validity, although it's questionable depending on how it's used. And it's a fairly reliable test. It's been used for a long time. So with the beep test itself, there's been a bit of a trend within Australia and among many of its tactical populations or recruitment processes to start to decrease the level required for initial recruitment. Okay, and I've spoken about this kind of before around some of the considerations, and I'm just going to look at it from both an organisational perspective and an individual perspective, because as the test gets lowered, that doesn't necessarily mean as an individual you need to meet the minimum standard. Okay, you don't have to lower your standard. Okay, you still have the right to kind of do your best or achieve your actual maximal physiological ability. So the beep test itself is one that's used predominantly across a lot of recruitments, and there's another one that's been used a little bit, which is the 30-15 IFT or intermittent fitness test. So I'm not going to talk specifically about how they're done, but it is relevant to one of the research articles that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to look mostly at the association between that and injuries in recruitment to give an idea of the payoff or the risk versus reward ratio when it comes to using it as improving recruitment numbers. So yeah, I get that as society becomes more sedentary and we have a decrease in people's actual physical ability, and there's a decrease in their actual movement competency and a whole heap of other things, is that you either lower your fitness standard or you put an intervention in place to bring them up to the standard you need before you go into recruitment. Ideally, you'd bring them up to the level you need, because ultimately they need to leave recruit training at the level that is required for operations. So the operational need is based on operational need. So if you reduce anything below that and you don't put something in place, then you're introducing risk. So looking at the research itself. So a couple of research articles I'm going to sort of talk about briefly. So the first one is one that was done with around 1,100 recruits or over 1,100 recruits. And what they found was that there was a 15% injury rate of lower limb injury. So they didn't look at anything other than lower limb, but they found a 15% injury rate within the recruit cohort. They found that females had higher injury rates when they just compared simply against males and females. However, when they looked at them for the same level of beep test, males had a higher injury risk than females. Okay, when they looked at just overall entry, females had a higher risk, and I'll talk about the reasons for that shortly. Okay, what they found was that every level of the beep test that they improved, their risk factor went down by 20%. And the level they sort of looked at the beep test as an average, so they just combined the whole cohort. So I don't actually have raw data for males versus females, but they found their average was 9.5 with a standard deviation of 1.6. So that would indicate one standard deviation below the average would be around about 8. So you could kind of surmise that if you're going below 8, then you're probably an injury risk, or your injury risk is going to go up by 20% than what it would be at 9 anyway. So that's sort of the first research article. So if we use around about an 8, and then we need a little bit of a gender variation in there, because it's not so much about the beep test stage, it's more around your aerobic capacity or your relative VO2, which comes down to the amount of oxygen you can utilize per kilo of body weight. So the next publication I'm going to look at was one that was done with policing, and they looked at just over 2,000 recruits. And what they found is out of that recruit numbers, there was a 26% injury rate. And they found the sort of level on the beep test that was sort of the difference between injury or not being injured for females was around about 6.4. and 7.4 for males. So if you were below that threshold, you're more likely to get injured. If you were above that threshold, then you're less likely to get injured. They also looked at the 30-15 IFT, which is potentially a better test, and Definitely a better one if you're actually going to prescribe training on the other side of it, because you can make the training very individualized to their result on that test. They found that 15.6 was the cutoff for females and 16.9 for males. So again, above or below that line was a significant difference in your injury rates. What they found was that injuries started to significantly decline on the beep test for females when they got above 6.8. And on the 30-15 IFT, it was above 16.5. So again, that sort of puts that beep test around about that 7 to 8 mark if you want to look at reducing your risk of injury, or an organisation looking at reducing the risk of injury to recruits when they're going through training. Okay, the next one I sort of want to look at is a military one. So that looked at around about 330 or just over 330 recruits, and they found a 28% injury rate. So we've sort of been fluctuating between that 15 to 26, 28%. Okay, what you'll notice from the first one to the other research articles is that first research article had a higher beep test, so that could potentially explain their lower injury rates. Okay, this one found that there was associated to fitness, so there was a positive relationship between increased fitness and reduced rate of injury. Okay, there was no actual raw data available for that one. It just had the association between fitness or increased fitness and reduced injury. Okay, there was another one that looked at just over 1,600 in-service personnel in law enforcement. Again, there was no injury rates for this one, and there was a lack of specific data. But they found associations between higher VO2 max and decreased rates of injury, as well as strength, age, and gender. So older people were more likely to hurt, the lower your level of strength, more likely to hurt, and they found that females were more likely to hurt. And that could be explained through some of the other physiological factors as well, okay, because there is some other research I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, I found another study that looked at associations between physical fitness or beep test results and the actual ability to successfully complete training. And what they found was the higher your beep test result, the more likely you were to actually successfully finish training. Okay, and they also found that those that had lower results on the beep test had much shorter retention. So they were separated from the organisation a lot earlier. So higher beep test, more likely to pass, more likely to have a prolonged career or a longer career within the organisation. Okay, and then went on to look at some actual critical reviews and systematic reviews, which were sort of studies of studies to see the strength of the research or data or results of those studies. Okay, and the first one I'm going to talk about looked at 11 studies. And again, these are just overall results. So they supported the aerobic capacity injury, that those with higher levels of aerobic capacity, specifically when measured through the beep test, were less likely to get injured, as also as it supported they were less likely to have issues with cardiovascular disease, or less likely to sort of get cardiovascular disease as they went through their career. And this is particularly important for police and and military, because both of those organisations have higher rates of cardiovascular disease than general population. So again, if you get people with higher levels of fitness, or you maintain a higher level of fitness, then you're going to decrease that risk factor as you get through your career or as you sort of age. Okay, the next one I looked at was a systematic review, which looked at over 30 studies. So this one actually found a low certainty of evidence for the studies that it looked at. And there could be a couple of reasons for this, but it did find that age, gender, and baseline fitness were all associated to increased rates of injury, or had associations to injury, much like all the other ones. They just found that there wasn't strong associations in the research they looked at because it was more in-service related. Okay, so when we actually look at the beep test itself, so the beep test is a fairly simple measure, as I've sort of explained, but one thing that it needs, or you need to consider with it, is that aerobic capacity is based on relative VO2, which is how much oxygen you could utilize in the muscle per kilo of body weight. So people that are larger muscle mass or larger mass that are running the same time as somebody, or the same level as somebody who's much smaller, actually have lower levels of fitness, even though they're going to record the same time. So this explains why a male and a female who run the same level on a beep test, the male has a higher injury rate or higher injury risk than the female, because it's a larger human being and has a relatively lower VO2 when you actually make that calculation. So although it's more sort of resource intensive to calculate relative VO2, it's going to give you a better measure. And all you really need to do is calculate somebody's body weight, have them run the beep test, and you can make a rough calculation, okay, which is going to have a little bit more accuracy than just the beep test itself. So that's one of the reasons. And then obviously age, as you age, your VO2 goes down as well. So you can put age in there as a factor, and you can start to work out their actual level of relative fitness, which will give you an indication of their risk of injury or whether they're at an increased risk of injury. So when we look at some of the organisations that have kind of done away with the sort of age and gender related VO2 or beep test measures, is that by having the lower standard, people who are older and males that achieve the minimum standard are actually at higher risk than females that reach that minimum standard. So they're probably less likely to get through training, they're going to have shorter careers, and they're more likely to get injured. So that's a consideration. So the research definitely supports a gender difference in the beep test results or the way that we measure these things. Okay, some of the issues with females getting lower or higher rates of injury is that the differential in their beep test level may be too much. So the required level for a female may need to be brought up a little bit to try and get it more in line so that we don't see an increased risk in these injury rates, because there is some other research out there that shows that when you compare genders or male to female at the same fitness level or physiological capacity, there's no difference in their injury risk. So this idea that females are more likely to get hurt is more associated to actual body mass than anything else. So when we sort of look at it, there's a consideration. So one of the other things with the beep test as well is it was used when I was in special operations to replace one of the tests that we were doing because it was a much easier test to do. The issue is that it wasn't valid to the actual operational needs of the organisation. So when they did the beep test, the people that actually scored the highest were less likely to pass a selection course than the people that scored the lowest. And there's a number of reasons for that, because again, the beep test is a very short sprint or very short shuttle that has a deceleration phase, a change of direction, and an acceleration phase. So people that are smaller and lighter are going to do better on the beep test as opposed to people that are larger and heavier. So if there's a requirement where there needs to be strength or large mass or large body mass is important for the job needs, then the beep test may not actually be that important, or it may not be that valid to what you're actually trying to do. But that may be more of a sort of specific or a unique case, but it definitely warrants consideration of what you're actually trying to do with your beep test. So when we look at the actual numbers that people are using or organisations are using, the research kind of indicates that you will probably want to be above 7. So if you want to reduce your risk of injury in recruit training and have people that have longer careers and potentially reduce the risk of contracting cardiovascular disease or having cardiovascular issues, then you probably want to be above that sort of 7 mark. Okay. I'm not too sure where people are getting their numbers from in these organisations or where the organisations are developing their numbers, but it's most likely just arbitrary numbers, or they've looked at some of the scales from years ago and worked out where they're at. But it probably needs to be a little bit more research into what is actually valid to the operational environment. When it comes to an individual sort of accountability, I would probably try and get myself above 7. Okay, 7's not really that high. And when I was talking about the selection-based research just a minute ago, that was numbers above 10. So the people that scored the lowest were actually scoring around about 10 on the beep test. Okay, the people that scoring the highest were up around 14 or 15, and they were the ones that were more likely to fail. So I would probably get myself to a level 7 or beyond. Okay, if you want to enter one of these services and you don't want to get injured or you want to reduce your risk of injury, then 7 is probably the minimum I'd try and achieve. I'd probably look at up around 10 or 11. But again, that is up to you and what you want to do. But if you want to get through training, you want really good outcomes and you want to sort of maximize your ability to learn, which does have an aerobic capacity component to it, then I would get myself as high as I can. Okay, with organizations, dropping the number or the level or the minimum standard for the beep test is probably more likely around just getting in numbers than it is around competency, because one of the issues when we have this risk of injury or reduced numbers is injuries are going to go up in training. If injuries go up in training, then the quality and quantity of training comes down as a result, because people just, or organizations just don't want to hurt people in training. Then the liability of risk then goes operationally, because now you have people that are just as likely to get injured or more likely to get injured because they're lower level of physical capacity. But now they've had less training, they're less competent, and it's going to change the way that they perceive things within their environment. So it has an actual operational or a negative outcome or consequence to operational performance, or it has a high risk of that. So these are something that needs to be considered. And if you have people coming in that are sort of higher risk of injury, then there's going to be an increase in sort of compensation payments, in rehabilitation costs, in all the costs that are associated with injury. And the cost of injury is quite large when you look at the actual medical and associated cost to it, time off work, people carrying that workload now because you've got less people available for duty. And these sort of things increases the load that you put on your organisation, where if we need to reduce the standard because of the issues within society and how sedentary it's coming and people just have lower level of physical readiness, then it probably needs to look or be looked at is providing an intervention or having some sort of intervention program where you're a dedicated fitness or improvement or performance improvement program, is that going to be cheaper or cost less in the long run than the increased cost of injury? So I would certainly hypothesize that if you had some sort of physical performance program, that you're going to reduce firstly the cost of injury, and secondly you're going to see performance improvement operationally within your organization. Okay, and it needs to be a proper program, not just sort of half-assing it with minimum standard performance. So there's some of the considerations, both as an organisation, as an individual. So if you're an individual who's looking to go into these sort of job roles, or you're within those job roles, I would definitely do my best to get yourself at peak performance before you go in. So I'd definitely look at what's the best you can do rather than meeting the minimum standard, because one of the other issues with these jobs is that generally people don't increase fitness throughout their career. So the majority of people that go in, they'll go through their recruit training. The first couple of years they're okay, and then their fitness declines over time for a number of reasons. So if you're an injury risk when you go in, you're definitely going to be an injury risk after a couple of years. The length of your career is potentially going to be compromised because of injury. Your time at work, your satisfaction, your mental health, everything like this is at risk. Okay, and then health issues later on around chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, the impacts of shift work are all going to increase because you just didn't have the physiological readiness when you went in. And a lot of these diseases are associated to your physiological capacity or your physiological health, and that includes mental health as well. So if you are looking at it, I would definitely look at what you want to get yourself, or your level of readiness you're going to get yourself to on the way in. And as an organisation, I would take a serious look at it as to what is the sort of entry level that we need, how can we get them to the exit level that we want, and what's that operational need that we're trying to achieve? Because just doing minimum standard, having nothing in place, you're just introducing second and third order consequences, or you're just kind of delaying the negative impacts until the operational environment. So just something to consider. There's a whole heap of research out there if you want to look at it yourself, go through. Certainly don't believe everything I say. This is more of just a discussion to generate some thinking. So if you've got any questions, please reach out. Otherwise, I hope there was something in there that sort of provoked a little bit of thought.